Well,
Want to get started?
let's do this thing.
All right.
So hey, I'm Wade Arnold. I've been on stage a couple times here. Terry and I text a lot, and we thought, let's do that in real life. That'd be really weird. And it'd be awesome if this was a little interactive. So we've got obviously some canned questions. I don't think anything's off limits from a Visa perspective or a Moov perspective, so happy to talk about whatever.
We're not sure who's interviewing whom, but
We actually said we didn't know who's interviewing whom, so.
we should start with the embarrassing story of how we met, though, because I remember reading about Moov, and I thought it was really interesting. And I tried to get hold of Wade a bunch of different ways. I really tried. I think I emailed you a few times, and then nothing, and I emailed you a few more times, and then nothing. And then I emailed Angela once I saw the investment. I emailed Matt Garrett, and then I heard nothing. And they're like, no, we've passed on your information. And then all of a sudden I got a note that's like, Wade wants to talk to you. So apparently this is how it works.
Okay. So what do you do at Visa?
Yes, hi everyone, Terry Angelos. I focus on fintech and crypto. And actually the most common question we got at this event is, why is Visa here? So, maybe I'll start a little bit with, and I actually signed a piece of paper that said we cannot talk about the company in any promotional way. So I'll talk more about like the general network perspective. If you look at what's happening in fintech, the networks are big players. Like Visa's got about 13 trillion in payment volume. But that's tiny compared to the 120 trillion in B2B or 18 trillion in cash. And so if you go back to Angela Strange's presentation, if we open source more entry points into banks and payment networks, and we can talk about that, I think the networks will get an increasing share of what they have today. There's so many flows that you can't access today because developers aren't able to innovate around the network. And so our view is, how can we support developers and open source projects so that there's more innovation happening on the network? And then we'll have to compete. I mean, there'll be plenty of other options, but there'll be a place for a fast authorization network, I think, in any scenario.
Yeah, and ubiquity is useful, right? And we can all argue that TCP could be better. The original protocol wasn't designed for how we use the internet today, but it's kind of nice that it works everywhere in the same way that you can authorize a card globally and get instant confirmation and through the network.
Yeah, I mean, I think of the networks as just setting standards. It's just standards for how you connect and standards for how you settle. I spend a lot of time on crypto. The way I think of Visa in a crypto sense is it's a centralized, highly performant layer 2 sitting on a fiat layer 1. So the thing you get is you go tap your card, you have an immediate authorization that sets up an IOU between a buyer and a seller, and then payment could be slow on Fedwire, it could be fast on something on RTP rails, could be fast on Solana. It doesn't matter to us and to the person transacting that the settlement layer happens on a different rail. And so that's increasingly how we think about the role that the networks play. And I think that stands up. Of course, there'll be competing rails. I mean, if someone comes up with a better way to move money, they should use it. And I think that those will emerge.
Yeah, and so coming here to FinTech DevCon, developers, how are developers working with Visa? Like, what's the way to interact with you all? And are you the go-to person? Even?
Yeah, so it's a good question. We talk a lot about developers, and we actually have like a developer center, like a set of APIs that you can access. But actually, the edge of our network is really like Stripe and Marqeta. So if you think about the way that the networks, so this is not just Visa, MasterCard, and others. The way that they operate is they have all this innovation happening. Like, we're not the people in Mexico onboarding, consumers from cash into a neobank. Like, that's not what we do. Other fintechs do that. But in order to do that, they have to connect to one of these payment rails. And so, developers probably interact with us most via our partners, the acquirer processes and the issuer processes. Certainly, if you have any questions at Visa, you should come to our team. We're very happy to help. We spend a lot of our time on the super early stage with like, hey, this is going to break your network. Is that allowed? And I love those questions. I get them all the time. And for the most part, they're super interesting. A good example of what's been happening lately is just in buy now, pay later, and that seemed very disruptive to the network. Turns out that most of the payments back on BNPL are on cards. So usually there's a way
now
for
you get 4 transactions rather than 1.
Yeah. Actually, my co-founder, Alex Rampell, is at Andreessen now. I was at a startup prior to Visa. Lost all credibility as a startup entrepreneur. But he was sort of tweeting last night about like how buy now, pay later could disrupt the entire ecosystem. And his argument is an interesting one, is that like when you have BNPL, the manufacturer of the product, like if it's 8 Sleep and they're willing to discount the product. You could think about it as a manufacturer-sponsored interchange, and we were sort of debating whether or not that will create a parallel network. But yeah, like the way to interact with both networks is typically at that layer. Some fintechs connect directly to the networks, and like one question I have, and I have it like for you, so you're building a connection to the network.
Yep.
Like maybe you should just open source that. If you think of the entire issuer processing stack, we have Marqeta and Stripe and Galileo and a bunch of other companies, but maybe that whole layer should be open source. You spin up an instance in a cloud farm somewhere, and now you have connectivity to the network. So maybe that's something you guys can look at. And I'd be curious, from your perspective, what parts of the network infrastructure you'd like to see open sourced?
Yeah, so yes, please. So, when it comes to merchant acquiring and issuing, I think the innovation is not in the, base 1, base 2, SMS. Those are all Visa terminology. That's not really the innovation, right? It's what am I doing with this specific MCC code? And am I blocking that? Am I doing different logic? Am I rolling that into a loan versus, instantly settling it? But Angelos, explains things better than me. Like the actual protocol being ISO 8583, that's open source already. But the really that primitive, which is the actual retry strategy and the O200 authorization requests and O210 when it comes back, and all of that to me could easily be open sourced. Now, open sourcing it doesn't mean that what would be the benefit of that, right? And so I see the first benefit being, as a developer, like I run Kubernetes on my laptop so that I can test different things out. It'd be awesome to be able to run an issuer on my laptop. I can issue a card. I can test my entire infrastructure. Yeah. That card number is not going to work at Target, but it allows me as a developer to build something locally really cool, ensure it's going to work, and go out there. The other thing that we see, especially with things like what we did with Nacha, I was never going to do an IAT transaction. Turns out PayPal does a couple of them. So they contributed all of that back into that SEC code and all of the information about that. I think the same thing would happen where you would get from an issuing and acquiring side, a full implementation of the entire stack that you could dev locally. And as we've talked about, it doesn't mean that everybody in the room, if they had the code, could go issue a card. They could test the software that it could, but you still need, a bank sponsor and PCI compliance and BIN and, all the things that go along with it. But I do think it would accelerate, time to market for the net new innovation. I look at companies like Lithic with what they're doing, and you're like, oh, I did like one little sliver of what they're doing as a complete service at my last job. And now that's just going to be combined, and I think you'd get more card products, more acquiring products that would be built on top of that, rather than, the first 2 years of the company just building out to those PDFs.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think that is a direction, and I think we would, support that. The other part of that is once you've got, this was take issuer processing as a starting point, and that's open source and that's available, and yes, you have to have licensed endpoints if you want to actually move money. But now, I think your example you had earlier was, now I want to do level 3 data for fleet payments. So when you actually use a fleet card, the network can give you the price of gas and the number of miles as a little metric in the auth request, which doesn't normally come through if you're just buying like a bag of chips. But to process that, someone's got to write the program, and that's being written once by somebody. It should be available kind of everywhere.
Right.
So I think that is a future that.
And it's a spec.
And it's a spec.
So
Yeah.
all these people are rewriting the exact same thing.
Yeah.
I was just reading through the base 2 stuff last week, which is nerdy stuff I do, and I didn't know that you could get flight data and actually know all your hops, and that's something that comes in the settlement. Most people who just need to make a debit card probably aren't going to implement that, but the community would.
Yeah. I mean, one idea we've had that we've never quite been able to pull off is to really have like a developer card where you can interrupt the auth and do cool things with it. So like when it comes to auth, it needs to be highly performant. Like we care a lot about like tap your card and yes, no answers. But like, what would you do as a dad if you could like interrupt auth and for your kids at college, you're like, you know what? You can only spend this much money on McDonald's, and the card gets declined. And so you see a little bit of this with like the just-in-time, like auth sort of logic engines inside of Marqeta. But like, wouldn't it be cool if like every developer could say, here's my card, I want to be able to add my own logic to the cards that I own and just muck around. And it would be a toy. It would be a Chris Dixon-like toy. I mean, why do you want to muck with your own authorization stream? But coming out of that would probably be something interesting where someone would develop some functionality that maybe we haven't thought about just because it's fun to muck with your own auth stream.
Right.
And we don't do it for like all sorts of reasons on like, well, every Visa card should be performant, and like if you go to the merchant and all of a sudden it's declined, and they're like, hey, why is it declined? Oh yeah, because I wrote some code last night to decline my own coffee transactions after 3 attempts at Starbucks. So like, there are reasons, but I think there's probably more benefit than downside from my perspective if we could do that.
Yeah. Well, even little things like that. When I was running Banno, we wanted push notifications for every time you swipe your card, because we're in fintech, Amex had it, so we wanted to copy it, right? And that was something that, okay, we're Banno, connected to Jack Henry, connected to First Data, all the way through. And so to get that authorization, most of the time we had to wait for settlement in order to do the push notification.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an opportunity, I think, that with all the networks, because they're designed for these large intermediaries, the FISs, the Fiservs, and now the Stripes and Galileos, to actually onboard all of the end clients. Because there's, if you look at the sort of network ecosystem, maybe there's 15, 20,000 actual connections, but there's 100,000, fintechs sitting on the back end of those.
Right.
And maybe those should just connect directly. And what does that open up? So that's a a question I think we ask ourselves, a lot.
Yeah, let's get
Let's
a
do it.
license agreement done. I bet people in here would think that was cool. I wanted to talk a little bit, about some of the expansion that you're doing as far as, we just did Currency Cloud as a deal, other investments. When you see those, is that to increase, processing volume, or is that to add more features for your partner banks? Or when you're looking at all these different fintech acquisitions, what's the motivation behind that? To get more net new products to your existing customers, or grow the network, or all of the above?
Yeah, sort of different, they're in sort of different categories. Currency Cloud was one where it was just being heavily used by a large number of our customers, and we felt that we could do a lot more with that particular functionality and make it something that worked better on our network.